In 1985, Anthony Ray Hinton was 29 years old when police came to his home and accused him of 2 murders. He told them they had the wrong man. He said he had been working when one of the crimes occurred, and he had no connection to the killings. But investigators had something they believed was far more convincing than his words, an old .38 caliber revolver belonging to his mother. State firearms examiners claimed that bullets recovered from 3 separate crime scenes had been fired from that weapon. That single piece of evidence would become the center of the prosecution's case, and eventually help send Anthony Hinton to Alabama's death row. For almost 3 decades, Hinton lived with the knowledge that the state intended to execute him. He watched years disappear behind prison walls while continuing to insist that he was innocent. Then, in 2002, 3 highly qualified firearms examiners, including the former chief of the FBI's Firearms and Tool Marks Unit, examined the evidence and reached a conclusion that struck at the heart of the original conviction. The bullets could not be matched to Hinton's mother's gun. But even that did not immediately make him free. His case would eventually reach the United States Supreme Court, where the justices unanimously ruled that his trial lawyer had provided constitutionally deficient representation. And even after that ruling, the legal process still had to run its course before Anthony Hinton could finally walk out of prison. This is not simply a story about a wrongful conviction. It is a story about what happens when an accusation becomes a conviction, when a piece of forensic evidence is treated as certainty, and when correcting a terrible mistake takes almost an entire lifetime. This is the story of Anthony Ray Hinton. It was February 1985 in Birmingham, Alabama, and a restaurant manager was working late when a robbery turned deadly. John Davidson was killed during an after-hours robbery at his restaurant. Several months later, another restaurant manager, Thomas Wayne Vason, was murdered during a remarkably similar robbery. In both cases, the killer struck when the restaurants were closing, when the managers were working with little protection and the night's cash was nearby. The similarities immediately raised fears that the same person was responsible. There were no eyewitnesses to the murders and no fingerprint evidence tying a suspect to the scenes, but investigators were under increasing pressure to find whoever was carrying out the attacks. Then, on July 25, 1985, another restaurant robbery took place in nearby Bessemer. This time, the manager survived. His name was Leon Smotherman. He had been shot, but unlike the previous 2 victims, he lived long enough to speak with investigators. His survival gave police something they desperately needed, a description of the person who had attacked him. When investigators later showed Smotherman a photographic lineup, he selected Anthony Ray Hinton. That identification would become one of the crucial pieces of the case against Hinton, even though Hinton maintained that he was innocent and had been working at the time of the Bessemer robbery. Anthony Ray Hinton was 29 years old. He had no history of violent crime, and before that summer, there was nothing about his ordinary working life that suggested he would become the center of a capital murder investigation. But once investigators focused on him, they began looking for evidence that could connect him to all 3 restaurant crimes. What they found was an old revolver belonging to his mother, who lived with him. The weapon was a .38 caliber revolver, and state forensic examiners would later tell prosecutors that bullets recovered from the 3 crime scenes had been fired from that gun. In the eyes of investigators, they had found the physical evidence they needed. In Anthony Hinton's life, that gun was about to become the object that would take away nearly 30 years of his freedom. There was something about the July 25th robbery that made Hinton's situation particularly important. Anthony said he had been working at a Bruno's warehouse when the crime occurred. According to the evidence later discussed in court, he was working at a locked warehouse about 15 miles away, and witnesses testified about the security of the facility and said they had not seen him leave. In other words, Hinton had an alibi that directly challenged the idea that he could have been the person who attacked Smotherman that night. Yet the prosecution did not charge him with the Smotherman robbery. Instead, the case against him for the 2 murders depended heavily on connecting the bullets from all 3 crimes to the same revolver. That distinction became enormously important. Prosecutors did not have to prove that Hinton had committed the 3rd robbery in order to convict him of the 2 murders, but the surviving victim's identification and the alleged firearms connection helped create a narrative that all 3 crimes had been committed by the same person. If the gun evidence was reliable, the prosecution could argue that the same weapon tied Hinton to the entire sequence of robberies. If the gun evidence was wrong, however, a central part of that narrative could collapse. The entire case was beginning to depend on a question that sounded simple, but would become extraordinarily complicated. Did those bullets really come from Anthony Hinton's mother's gun? At trial, the state's firearms experts said yes. They testified that microscopic markings on the bullets showed that they had been fired from the revolver. To someone sitting on a jury, the testimony sounded scientific and precise. It gave the prosecution something that an accusation alone could never provide: the appearance of objective proof. And Anthony's defense needed a qualified expert who could challenge that testimony. But his lawyer mistakenly believed that Alabama law limited the amount of money available for such an expert. The Supreme Court later found that the lawyer had failed to investigate the funding law properly and had not sought the additional resources that were available. Instead, the defense ended up relying on Andrew Payne, a retired civil engineer who had no expertise in forensic firearms identification and who, according to the later record, could not operate the equipment necessary to conduct the examination. The prosecutor attacked Payne's credibility in front of the jury, leaving the state's firearms evidence essentially unchallenged. Anthony Hinton was now facing a capital murder conviction with the central physical evidence against him largely intact. The trial moved toward its conclusion, and Anthony Hinton's future was now in the hands of a jury. The prosecution had presented the firearms evidence. It had presented the identification from Leon Smotherman, and it had constructed a case in which the revolver from Hinton's mother's home appeared to connect him to the murders. The defense had challenged the prosecution's case, but it had not been able to present the kind of qualified firearms expert who could effectively confront the state's central forensic claim. The jury convicted Anthony Ray Hinton of 2 counts of capital murder. In 1986, he was sentenced to death. He had entered the criminal justice system as a 29-year-old man insisting that he was innocent. Now he was being taken to Alabama's death row, where his future was no longer measured in decades or careers or family milestones. His future was measured in appeals, court dates, and the possibility of an execution. For Hinton, the most painful part was that he knew what he had not done. He knew he had not murdered those men. He knew the gun belonged to his mother. And he knew that the prosecution's story did not match the reality he remembered. But knowing the truth inside your own mind is very different from proving it in a courtroom. Once 12 jurors returned a guilty verdict, the burden shifted. Anthony was no longer simply a suspect defending himself. He was a convicted murderer facing execution. The appeals began, but the conviction survived. Alabama's appellate courts upheld the judgment, and Hinton remained on death row. In 1990, he began pursuing post-conviction relief and argued, among other things, that his lawyer had been ineffective for failing to obtain a qualified firearms expert. But years would pass before the courts were forced to confront the full significance of that argument. Death row changed the meaning of time. For most people, a year can disappear almost without notice. A birthday comes, a season changes, and suddenly another year is gone. For someone awaiting execution, time feels different. Every year is another year spent wondering whether the state will eventually carry out the sentence. Anthony Hinton lived with that uncertainty while maintaining the same claim he had made from the beginning. He was innocent. His mother continued to stand behind him. She believed her son and refused to accept the conviction as the final word about who he was. But inside prison, the legal system moved at a pace that was almost impossible to comprehend. Appeals could take years. Motions could sit unresolved. Evidence could remain untouched. And the fact that a person had been sentenced to death did not mean that the courts would quickly revisit every question surrounding the conviction. Meanwhile, the central piece of evidence remained the revolver. According to EJI, the state's entire theory connecting Hinton to the 2 murders depended on its firearms expert's assertion that bullets from the 3 crimes had been fired from that gun. Without that testimony, the state acknowledged at trial that it could not convict Hinton of capital murder. That made the scientific examination of the bullets more than a technical detail. It was the foundation of the prosecution's case. For years, Hinton waited. Then, in 1999, his case came to the Equal Justice Initiative and Bryan Stevenson. Stevenson and his team began examining the record, the trial, the legal history, and most importantly, the evidence that had been used to send a young man to death row. What they found would eventually turn the case in a completely different direction. When Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative began representing Anthony Hinton in 1999, they did not treat the original conviction as something that could simply be accepted because a jury had returned a verdict. They went back to the evidence and asked whether the central claims made at trial could actually withstand serious scrutiny. One of the most important questions was also one of the simplest. If the state was right about the gun, could independent firearms experts reproduce or confirm the original conclusion? EJI found 3 highly qualified firearms examiners willing to examine the evidence. One of them had previously served as chief of the FBI's firearms and toolmarks unit. They examined the bullets and the revolver using their own expertise, rather than simply accepting the conclusions reached by the original state examiners. In June 2002, they testified that the bullets from the 3 crimes could not be matched to one another or to the revolver recovered from Hinton's mother's home. Their conclusion directly contradicted the forensic testimony that had helped send Hinton to death row. That was an extraordinary development. For years, the revolver had been presented as the physical bridge connecting Anthony Hinton to the murders. Now, qualified experts were saying that bridge did not exist. The evidence could not support the claim that the gun had fired those bullets, and yet Anthony still remained behind bars. This is one of the most important moments in the entire story, because it reveals how difficult it can be to correct a wrongful conviction. Finding evidence of innocence is one thing. Getting a legal system to act on that evidence is another. EJI repeatedly asked state officials to reconsider the case, but for more than a decade, those requests did not produce the freedom Hinton needed. Anthony had already spent years waiting for the courts to listen. Now he had independent experts challenging the very evidence that had convicted him. Yet he remained a prisoner. The new firearms evidence should have been the moment when everything changed. Instead, the legal battle continued. Hinton remained on death row while his lawyers continued challenging the conviction. The passage of time made the injustice even more painful. The young man who had entered prison in his 20s was growing older behind bars, while the outside world continued moving without him. And then Anthony lost his mother. For a man who had spent so many years insisting that he was innocent, his mother's death was another devastating blow. She had been one of the people who believed him when the system did not. She had seen her son condemned to death and continued to stand by him. But she would never see the day when the prison doors opened. Anthony was still waiting. The case was now moving through a long and complicated legal process. The new firearms evidence was important, but the Supreme Court case that eventually reached Washington focused on a different question: whether Hinton's constitutional right to effective assistance of counsel had been violated because his lawyer failed to obtain adequate funding for a qualified firearms expert at trial. The answer would come in 2014. On February 24th, 2014, the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Hinton's trial attorney had performed efficiently. The court vacated the lower court judgment and sent the case back for further proceedings. It is important to understand exactly what the decision meant. The Supreme Court did not simply declare that Hinton was innocent. It ruled that his original defense had been constitutionally inadequate and required the lower courts to reconsider the case under the correct legal standard. For Anthony Hinton, however, that ruling opened a door that had been closed for nearly 30 years. After the Supreme Court ruling, the case returned to Alabama. A new trial was ordered, and the prosecution now had to confront the evidence under a very different set of circumstances. The state could no longer rely on the original firearms testimony as though it had never been challenged. Independent experts had already testified that the bullets could not be matched to Hinton's revolver, and the original defense had been denied the kind of expert assistance that could have challenged the state's case at trial. The result was devastating to the prosecution's original theory. The supposed match between the bullets and Hinton's mother's gun could not be sustained. The evidence that had once been presented as the crucial scientific connection between Hinton and the murders had been discredited. Without that evidence, the case against Hinton could no longer stand in the way it once had. For Anthony, however, this was not simply a courtroom victory. It was the possibility of getting back something that had been taken from him when he was 29 years old: his freedom. On April 3rd, 2015, the charges against Anthony Ray Hinton were dismissed, and he walked out of the Jefferson County Jail in Birmingham. EJI records that he left at approximately 9:30 that morning, free for the first time in 30 years. He was 58 years old. Think about that transformation. When Anthony entered prison, he was a young man at the beginning of adulthood. When he walked out, his hair had turned gray and almost 3 decades had passed. The world he returned to was not the world he had left. Technology had changed. People had changed. His own family had changed. And the mother who had believed in him was gone. But the prison gates were finally behind him. There is something almost impossible to explain about ordinary freedom when you have spent decades without it. For someone who has never been incarcerated, walking outside is so normal that it barely registers as an event. You open a door. You step onto a sidewalk. You look up at the sky. You decide where you want to go. For Anthony Hinton, every one of those things had become extraordinary. On the morning of April 3rd, 2015, he walked out of the Jefferson County Jail, surrounded by family, friends, supporters, lawyers, and reporters. He had spent 30 years waiting for that moment. Now it was finally happening. The man who had once been taken away as a 29-year-old defendant was leaving prison as a 58-year-old free man. And then came the words that would become inseparable from his story. Anthony looked toward the sky and said, The sun does shine. Those words carried almost 30 years of meaning. They were about sunlight, but they were also about survival. Anthony had spent years living in a place where his future was supposed to end. He had watched the justice system insist that he was a murderer. He had watched appeals fail. He had lost his mother. He had lost decades that no one could ever return. Yet he was still standing. He could finally see the sky without looking through prison bars. And he was free. The natural question after a story like this is what Anthony Hinton felt toward the people who had helped put him on death row. After everything that had happened, anger would have been understandable. Bitterness would have been understandable. Wanting revenge would have been understandable. But Hinton chose another path. He began speaking publicly about his experience and became an advocate connected with the Equal Justice Initiative. His story became part of a larger conversation about wrongful convictions, the death penalty, inadequate legal representation, and the danger of unreliable or misleading forensic evidence. EJI describes his case as an example of how race, poverty, inadequate legal assistance, and failures to properly confront innocence can combine to produce a devastating miscarriage of justice. His memoir, The Sun Does Shine, carried that story far beyond Alabama. But the book and the speeches could never restore the years he had lost. They could only tell the world what had happened. And there is another painful truth that should never be forgotten. Freeing Anthony Hinton did not solve the murders of John Davidson and Thomas Wayne Vason. Those men had families. They had lives. They deserved justice too. Proving that Hinton was not responsible did not automatically identify the person who killed them. That is what makes wrongful convictions so tragic. When the wrong person is convicted, there are often two victims: the innocent person whose life is destroyed, and the victim whose real killer may remain free. Anthony Ray Hinton's story is ultimately about much more than one gun or one courtroom. It is about how fragile justice can become when a system stops questioning its own assumptions. Investigators believed they had found their suspect. The state believed its firearms experts had established a connection. A defense lawyer failed to obtain the expert assistance his client needed. A jury accepted the prosecution's evidence, and a young man was sentenced to die. But the story also shows that evidence must be challenged, especially when the consequence is irreversible. The Supreme Court's decision in Hinton v. Alabama established an important constitutional point about effective assistance of counsel. The court found that Hinton's lawyer had acted unreasonably when he failed to seek additional funding for a qualified firearms expert because of a mistaken belief about the funding limit. The firearms evidence then became even more significant. Independent experts had concluded that the bullets could not be matched to Hinton's revolver. The evidence that once appeared to make the case against him became evidence that undermined the conviction. And finally, after almost 30 years, Anthony Hinton walked free. He could not recover the years. He could not bring his mother back. He could not become 29 again. He could not erase the memories of death row. But he could choose what happened next. He could allow the past to consume the rest of his life. Or he could use the life he had left. He chose the second. Anthony Ray Hinton's story is ultimately about much more than one gun or one courtroom. It is about how fragile justice can become when a system stops questioning its own assumptions. Investigators believed they had found their suspect. The state believed its firearms experts had established a connection. A defense lawyer failed to obtain the expert assistance his client needed. A jury accepted the prosecution's evidence, and a young man was sentenced to die. But the story also shows that evidence must be challenged, especially when the consequence is irreversible. The Supreme Court's decision in Hinton v. Alabama established an important constitutional point about effective assistance of counsel. The court found that Hinton's lawyer had acted unreasonably when he failed to seek additional funding for a qualified firearms expert because of a mistaken belief about the funding limit. The firearms evidence then became even more significant. Independent experts had concluded that the bullets could not be matched to Hinton's revolver. The evidence that once appeared to make the case against him became evidence that undermined the conviction. And finally, after almost 30 years, Anthony Hinton walked free. He could not recover the years. He could not bring his mother back. He could not become 29 again. He could not erase the memories of death row. But he could choose what happened next. He could allow the past to consume the rest of his life. Or he could use the life he had left. He chose the second. Anthony Ray Hinton entered Alabama's prison system as a 29-year-old man who believed that the truth would eventually save him. It took almost 30 years. By the time the prison doors opened, he was 58. The young man who had once walked into a courtroom had become an older man walking out of a jail. Between those two moments were decades that could never be recovered. But Anthony walked forward. He walked toward his family. He walked toward a life that had been taken from him. And he walked toward a future that, for years, he had not been sure he would ever see. His story remains a warning about the power of a conviction, the danger of treating forensic evidence as unquestionable, and the enormous human cost of a justice system that gets it wrong. But it is also a story about resilience. Anthony Hinton was told that he was a murderer. He was told that he would die in prison. He spent decades waiting for an execution that never came. And when the evidence finally collapsed and the prison door opened, he did not step into another cell. He stepped into the sunlight. He looked up. And after almost 30 years of waiting, the sun did shine. End.